and welcome to Military History Inside Out, brought to you by WarScholar. We talk about military history from ancient times to modern, and everything in between. I'm Chris Alvarez, and thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Dr. Geoffrey Plank, author of Atlantic Wars, From the 15th Century to the Age of Revolution, published by Oxford University Press, June 19th, 2020. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thanks for talking to me.
So first, how did you get into studying this subject and writing a book on it?
Well, I've been, studying history for 25 years now, and I've earlier written books on Nova Scotia and on the British Empire as a whole, and on Quaker abolitionism. And with all of those topics, I was studying things that crossed national boundaries and imperial boundaries, involving people on various sides of the ocean. And so, like many people, I've become, interested in stories that cross the ocean and looking at the Atlantic as a whole. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is that there's a common theme through all of my work, and I didn't start out my career thinking I wanted to be a military historian, mm-hmm. which is kind of bizarre when you think of where I started. But wars defined the stories I was telling, about the expulsion of the Acadians in Nova Scotia or the Quaker debate about slavery. And so looking at the Atlantic as a whole and warfare in the Atlantic as a whole really brought together all of my interests. Mm-hmm. But then the other thing is that, there's a lot of people who've been interested in Atlantic history. There really aren't that many single-authored syntheses of the whole story of the Atlantic. And so I wanted to take that on.
Mm-hmm. So, considering this volume covers about 300 years and numerous countries, how did you break it down and make it manageable?
Well, I'm not sure whether I would recommend this to everybody, but I wrote it out of order. I started with an outline of the main themes and chapters I wanted to write, and then I wrote chapter 6 and then chapter 3, and I don't know exactly, and then 11 and so forth, mm-hmm. and then later pieced them all together. But I wanted to make each chapter a project, and then the other thing is, and this really goes counter to kind of your training as an academic historian, mm-hmm. every time I was trying to push myself into areas that I wasn't familiar with. I mean, looking at the, articles and books by other people and trying to educate myself as widely as possible. And so, one of the main aims of the book was to, have a comprehensive geographical scope. And like you say, it covers a huge amount of time.
Mm-hmm. I see that it's divided into three main parts: warfare at sea, warfare on land, and then transatlantic warfare. Can you tell me a bit about how you approached warfare at sea?
Well, warfare at sea was, one of the most important things to me about the whole book, because it struck me as one of the areas that people, take for granted too quickly, too often. I'm talking about historians, but I think people in general, that the whole question of European and colonial dominance of the water, it seems to me, defines both what counts as the Atlantic world and basically much of what happens afterwards. And so I wanted to put a huge emphasis on that, partly because I think it's foundational to the whole story I'm telling. Mm-hmm. Within that section, there's a chapter on the technological development of ships. And one of my points there is the, formative influence of military considerations in just the basic design of European sailing ships. Mm-hmm. And the way that translates as you go through the section into the whole culture of maritime life, and not just among military ships, but also within fishing vessels, merchant vessels, whaling vessels. They're armed, they're prepared for combat, and especially in the 16th century, whalers are sent out across the Atlantic, basically primarily for military purposes. Mm-hmm. And as you go through the other sections of the other chapters in that section, sailors are transferred from one kind of ship to the other. They're basically, their skills are transferable from civilian to military life. And so, the sailors chapter is also very important, because it strikes me it's really the first Atlantic community where you have people from different nations literally side by side, not necessarily enjoying each other's company, but often forced to to work together and to fight against each other or for each other. It's a chaotic environment, and I guess that sort of, I think, sets a certain amount. It certainly profoundly influences the development of Atlantic warfare, everywhere across the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm. Now that brings to mind a question. I don't know if it's beyond the scope of what you described, but I recall being told that piracy was the first form of democracy in the world, that, sailors who left wherever they were and joined together as a criminal band voted for their own leaders, in contrast to what was going on within the naval military hierarchies. Did you?
Yeah, I'm not entirely convinced about that. I think partly because, even the people who argue that acknowledge how violent the life of life is for a pirate and for people subjected to attacks from pirates. Mm-hmm. But I'm much more on the side. There's a scholarly debate about this, that there's a fine line, and it's not always clear what the difference is between privateering vessels who are operating with the license from their imperial governments, or pirates. And there are narratives which I tell in the book of sailors who think they are going on merchant. They're serving on a merchant vessel, and then their captain makes the decision to either take on a letter of marque and start attacking. And I guess I would put more of an emphasis on that there's a way in which men, it's intrinsic to the whole operation of sailing vessels that you don't really have control over your fate. I mean, if the ship decides or the captain decides that they're going to go into raiding, you are there on the ship, and there you are. You're suddenly in a military situation. So I'm not, to be honest. Yeah, I guess I feel pretty strongly about that piracy is not democratic.
Okay, interesting. So why did you start from the 15th century? What was the impetus there?
Well, the impetus there really is the sailing vessels. I was one of my aims in sort of telling this story the way I did was to break out of a more old-fashioned imperial narrative, which generally would place a pride of place on Christopher Columbus and the Spanish expansion across the Atlantic. And I wanted to, and there are various ways you can break down that narrative. I actually, in the introduction, start with the Norse voyages to Newfoundland and Greenland, and it matters to me a lot on the chronology that the Norse are in Greenland for continuously until the mid 15th century, and so there is contact between the Inuit and the Norse long before Columbus comes along. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just a matter of factual accuracy. You can't just say, the story starts with Columbus. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, at one point when I was thinking about the book, I was thinking of starting with the Norse and trying to tell a continuous story from there. But actually, the Norse experience is quite different from the whole dynamic of European expansion after they get these larger sailing vessels. Mm-hmm. And so I guess it matters to me more that there's a contrast between the Norse experience and what follows, which is based on the carrying capacity of large sailing ships, really.
Mm-hmm. And why did you end at the Age of Revolution? Just a word limit, or?
No, absolutely not. No. Again, going back to what I was saying about sailors, but I think to a great extent it applies to all sorts of fighting forces on land as well. Before the Age of Revolution, there's a way in which people are caught up in battles, irrespective of their political inclinations or allegiances. There are alliances that cross all sorts of imperial boundaries and tie together indigenous people and people, fighting to escape slavery. And there's a whole tangle of alliances, which is central to the whole pattern of warfare I'm describing up to the Age of Revolution. And then I think things do change radically at that point that you get, and I don't, in the book, that is a space limitation point, that it happens in naval warfare as well as land warfare, that sailors that they internalize a sense of, many of them, a sense of patriotic or loyal service. They begin to believe that there's a sort of discipline and duty tied to the particular cause they're fighting for. And so there's a huge change in military culture around the Age of Revolution. Mm-hmm. The other thing, the dark side of that is that it is part of a process that delegitimizes those alliances I was talking about earlier, mm-hmm. which leaves indigenous people who want to fight colonization or enslaved people who want to, escape slavery on their own against national governments. The old, more flexible pattern of military action in politics mm-hmm. made it possible for people to make alliances that are no longer possible after the Age of Revolution.
I'm speaking with Geoffrey Plank, author of Atlantic Wars. You can find more information on the Oxford University Press page for the book. If you like this podcast so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please go to my website, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com for links to news, videos, new books, and my social media links. If you're interested in other kinds of history, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal, historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast. Thinking about warfare at sea, so the Ottomans were pretty busy in the Mediterranean, but you never hear about them sailing out into the Atlantic and getting themselves involved in the Atlantic world the way the rest of Europe was doing. Mm-hmm. Can you address that at all?
I don't pose that as one of my central research questions, why some groups get into the Atlantic and others don't. Mm-hmm. One of the stories I tell at the beginning or early on in my slavery chapter involves a North African raid on Iceland, seizing, Icelanders and taking them to North Africa as basically, most of them die as slaves in North Africa. Mm-hmm. And there is, not, the connection between the North African states and the Ottoman Empire is very, loose at the, in the early modern period. Mm-hmm. But there is a way in which Mediterranean patterns of captive taking spread out into the Atlantic. And something else that really surprised me when I was doing the research is that galleys actually are crossing the Atlantic. They're mostly European galleys, not North African galleys. But a lot of the technologies and practices, we tend to sort of connect to the Mediterranean are actually spreading out into the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I should have, when I said Ottomans, I should have explained that I meant everyone operating around the Mediterranean that was, Muslim. What would you say are the main events within warfare at sea? Are there any main events that you would point to as far as affecting what you researched?
You mean like turning points?
Yeah, either military actions or technology or any other event.
That's the structure of the book, was self-consciously meant to be thematic. They're describing changes, mm-hmm. but each of the chapters covers a huge period of time. Mm-hmm. It's a gradual process, but that shift to larger sailing vessels is a critical one. The success in putting cannons on ships is critical. Mm-hmm. There's just a gradual shift from a pattern of warfare where the aim is to board vessels to a much more long distance artillery oriented pattern. In the 17th century, you move to much more towards specialized warships, which is very important. There's another turning point is in the British Navy, they captured the French warship, the Invincible, and they're stunned by how by its size and capabilities, and they start redesigning their own warships. This in the 1740s, mm-hmm. Which is critical for the ultimate success of the British Navy. I do think, but I wouldn't, to be honest, this is not. My one of the purposes of this book, or I'm not arguing against a view of history that sort of says this is the pivotal battle and everything was changed after that. But I'm really not primarily interested in engaging in that. But I do actually think that the Battle of Quiberon Bay off the coast of France was a critical thing in 1758, basically allowing the British to, up until that time, the British are not, dominant the way we kind of, retrospectively think, the British Navy is the most, powerful Navy in the world. But it did make a huge difference. And then there are a sequence of surprising British amphibious operations in Louisbourg, and then Canada, and then in the Caribbean, and in Cuba. It's startling actually how quickly and for that period of time how effectively the British can use their ships to really shift things in North America. That's a point that's been made before, but. The cover of my book has a picture of the Battle of Quiberon Bay. So.
So it seems that as far as warfare at sea, indigenous populations that were impacted by what happened seemed more, at least at sea warfare, seemed to be more observers than participants at all, as far as the major powers fighting over the Atlantic.
Well, I think you have to make be careful to make the distinction between sailors and people in commands of ships.
Okay.
Because going back to the 16th century in the Spanish in the Caribbean, they are employing indigenous Americans as pilots, and there are episodes from that early period of indigenous Americans seizing Spanish ships and actually sailing them across the Caribbean. And I tell another story in the book of a Micmac people who are identified as pirates who seize a ship off the coast of Nova Scotia, and then after they've seized this ship, they begin to think that their only way they can survive is to start a sequence of seizing further ships. So I guess there are a couple of points I would like to make about that. One is that there's nothing intrinsically difficult about controlling a ship or doing the work of sailing. And you have indigenous Americans working on ships through the whole period. Different communities are more familiar with it than others. But then, so yes, there are indigenous Americans sailing. The problem is that they don't have access to port facilities. They can't maintain ships. And so the command infrastructure and the logistics that you would need to keep ships on the water is basically, barred. They can't reach it. They can't access that capital or that infrastructure. And that's why they, retrospectively seem like they're bystanders in the story of naval warfare.
So let's turn to warfare on land. Do you talk about mostly warfare in the New World, or do you also include the Old World? How do you approach that?
Yeah, well, I definitely talk about warfare in Europe and Africa as well as the Americas. It's the balance of the book is probably half of that section is about the Americas, but it's important. You need to know what's happening in Europe and Africa to make any sense of what's happening in the Americas, which is, I guess, again the point of doing Atlantic history as opposed to doing colonial history in the Americas.
So again, I would ask, as in warfare at sea, how much were indigenous peoples observers to what was going on versus participants? I know there's a lot more combat with indigenous populations, but if you could comment on that.
Well, the indigenous Americans were central to the whole military experience. Now, one point, which I guess is maybe related to the question you were just saying, with one very peculiar exception, indigenous Americans are only fighting on land in North and South America and the Caribbean. They're not coming to Europe. But in one particular episode, they the indigenous Brazilians are actually brought by the Dutch from Brazil to Africa in a grand scheme with the idea that they had just superior warrior ability in a terrain without roads and fighting people who were thought from the Dutch perspective to be fighting in a savage manner or whatever. So the Dutch believed they needed their own, imported warriors who were skilled in that kind of fighting, which is I think it's an important, episode. It brings out, something that is, you can see in the European documents, through this whole period, a sense that indigenous American warriors have skills that Europeans don't have. They're often described as being able to, crouch more quietly or jump more nimbly or, go for longer periods without food or water. There are all sorts of, stereotypes that develop, which on the one hand reflect a sense of European vulnerability in the Americas, but they also lay the groundwork for racial stereotypes which continue beyond the early modern period.
Mm-hmm. Do you talk much about warfare at sea and warfare on land in regards to Africa, the West African coast? Yes,
definitely. One of the big themes, which is why the book is divided into sections on sea and on land, is that that there's a very stark pattern of European dominance of the deep ocean and European weakness, perceived weakness on the continents of North and South America and Africa, and I think it's more pronounced in the African case than it is even in the American cases. I'm following here the lead of John Thornton, the historian of Africa, who basically, quite rightly, pushed back against an old idea that the Europeans didn't move into Africa in large numbers because of disease. There were Europeans and, Portuguese in Angola who, could survive fine. I mean, some died and some didn't, but the disease does not explain why the Europeans did not establish large colonies in Africa in the 17th, 18th century. The reason they didn't is because they were pushed out, because the Africans were fighting them and successfully defending their own, territories against possible. Let me put this. Even putting it like that is wrong, because there are very few attempts on the part of Europeans to establish large colonies in Africa, but that was a large part of the reason for that is because the Europeans were afraid of military resistance if they tried.
Mm-hmm. Well, I get the impression that definitely between the indigenous people of America versus African nations, that African nations had forts, had more modern militaries. Is that correct?
I think that's correct. Yeah, and there is a sort of way you can frame that debate. You were asking, do I talk about Europe? But there's a model of sort of military revolution that the model comes from Europe, and military historians have argued about whether you can apply it to Africa. But you certainly do see in places like Dahomey the development of states with huge fortifications and armies with real discipline, using firearms in ways that do resemble very much the European pattern.
Mm-hmm. And when I said modern, I meant contemporary to the age, to what Europeans were using and doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you differentiate at all between the North and South Atlantic in any way? Is there anything important as far as dividing it up that way?
I could have done more with that. I think that's a good point. It sort of runs through the book. It's not an organizational difference. Mm-hmm. As I was telling you when I was talking about chronology, it matters to me a great deal that there is this long history of contact in the Arctic that is interrupted, perhaps briefly, in the second half of the 15th century. But I'm saying something obvious here, that African slavery doesn't reach the Arctic on a large scale. So the players are different in the the far North Atlantic, and obviously that makes a huge difference. But I guess I would, rather than try and draw a line through the Atlantic and say, well, down there the story is this, and up there the story is that. I think what interests me more is the way that individuals and events cross between different parts of the Atlantic. And I tell the story of one man who was held as a slave in the Caribbean and is brought to Denmark, ends up fighting for the Danish Navy. And then after they try to re-enslave him, he ends up escaping to Iceland. And so, that's one example, but there are others, on a more highfalutin scale. Martin Frobisher serves in, West Africa, and then ends up leading a expedition into Labrador. That people are moving all over the Atlantic, including moving from the north to the south and the south to the north.
Mm-hmm. I've read discussions about how the development of racism, that maybe it wasn't so much, early history didn't have as much racism, but then it developed in this period, sort of. Do you have any comments about that issue, or do you discuss it in the book?
I do discuss it in the book, and when I was earlier talking about the stereotypes that get associated with warriors, you can see a sort of sense of almost a very stark sense of alienation from on the part of European observers in relation to the warriors they're encountering. And sometimes, as I said, they feel terribly inferior to the people they're seeing. Sometimes they see these warriors and think that these are people we need, and we need to establish allies. But that sense of difference is stark, and stark from the beginning. What happens, or gets more intense over the period I'm describing, is there are a couple of points to be made here. It's not just about the way they fight, their military abilities, but also perceived atrocities and different, military practices like scalping or torture or the killing of prisoners. There's a kind of list of indictments that European observers put on Africans and indigenous Americans, which certainly play an important role in the developing of racial stereotypes. There's also, on the other hand, practices that the Europeans engage in, which terrify and alienate indigenous Americans and Africans. And one of the ones that I emphasize in the book, because I do think it's critically important, is rape. That indigenous Americans, certainly in North America, appear to have a strong taboo against sex in a military context, and European soldiers don't. So this people talk about a clash of cultures. It intensifies that sense of alienation between different communities. But something changes in the Revolutionary era, which is that people in the period I'm mostly writing about still make alliances across these boundaries, and to a certain extent see them as useful politically and economically to kind of work together in the context of this sense of antagonism or alienation or strangeness. When you get to the Revolution, the European version of all the colonial history that's come up to that point changes, and there's a way in which indigenous American and African efforts to assert themselves become associated with a very peculiar kind of savagery, and it's sort of the idea of uncrossable boundaries, and they live in their own worlds and they can fight in their own way, but we're not going to engage with that. I think that sense of seeking to completely distance indigenous warriors is something that develops in the Revolutionary era.
I'm speaking with Geoffrey Plank, author of Atlantic Wars. You can find more information on the Oxford University Press page for the book. If you like this podcast so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. please go to my website, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com for links to news, videos, new books, and my social media links. If you're interested in other kinds of history, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast. Before I turn to ask how you did your research, are there any other themes or significant issues that we haven't touched on yet that you'd like to mention?
Yes, the one thing I wanted, because we were kind of walking through the sailing section,
mm-hmm.
and I just would want to nail down how important it was that sailing ships were capable of carrying large numbers of people,
mm-hmm.
and one of the it's sort of a point that I was surprised as I did the research how often entire colonies were evacuated and moved across the ocean, European, basically reversing the process of colonization.
Hmm.
And the Spanish start to try to do that in the 1620s. There's a sequence of mass evacuations that continue right up into the mid-18th century. That idea that we don't want you here, we're going to just send you thousands of miles away, is a theme that it's not a theme, it's a practice that's fundamental to the whole practice of warfare in this period. And one of the things I also wanted to emphasize, thinking about how this works on an Atlantic scale, is that you can see a similar approach to the deportation of your adversaries in Africa, on the part of warring states in Africa, who basically becomes a common practice in African wars to sell their captives to the Europeans so that the Europeans can do the work of sailing them across the ocean. But if you think especially about what this does to the world in the early modern period, you have literally millions of Africans getting sent across the water. And I guess one of the things I really wanted to do in the book is get people to think about the slave trade as a military operation, not just a military operation, but it is clearly a military operation. And I think when you think about slavery in that context as sort of a product of military technologies, actual fighting in Africa, the use of ships for mass deportations, I think it changes the way you look at slavery in the Americas as well. Another point I made in my chapter on slavery, which I think I'd like to just emphasize,
sure,
is there's a common notion that slavery is ancient. There was slavery everywhere: slavery in the Americas, slavery in Africa, slavery in Europe, at least until the late Middle Ages. The Atlantic slave trade and the whole practice of slavery in the Atlantic was quite different. And one of the ways it was new and different, beyond the whole question of scale, is that it favored the enslavement of men on a large scale, and that you're just trying to see that that preference for men is something that most societies avoided because of military issues. They're harder. Men are more likely to successfully resist being held in slavery.
Mm-hmm.
It also, I think, this whole military background to the slave trade goes a long way to explaining the nature, or certainly the perception of resistance in the Americas, and the not only the establishment of maroon communities in Brazil and many parts of the Americas, but also the fierce disciplinary and military responses to the threat of maroon warfare in Americas. That basically, you get warfare as an intrinsic part of the operation of slavery, both in Africa and in the Americas.
Do you have any instances in the book that discuss how indigenous people in the Americas and African slaves reacted when they met with each other, like seeing another group oppressed by Europeans, maybe thinking they're the only ones, and then they're brought together like, oh, we're both oppressed by Europeans. Does that make sense?
Yes, and it happens. And one of the clearest, I mean, there are lots of examples of this, but one of the most interesting is, on the island of Hispaniola, very early in the 16th century, what may be the first slave revolt in the Spanish Empire, I think it's in the 1520s, is an alliance with indigenous Americans who are also fighting against Spanish colonization on their island. And there are ways in which you can tell the story which makes it sound, or makes it appear to be a slave revolt like slave revolts that you get later in the early modern period. Mm-hmm. And then there are other ways to tell the story where it looks like it's sort of an indigenous operation. Archaeologists have now sort of found sites where, it's clear that these camps of people who are resisting the Spanish are mixed communities of people from Africa and indigenous Americans. And there are other examples like that from Brazil in the later 16th century. But there are also plenty of examples of, indigenous Americans helping to capture, people escaping from slavery and basically operating in alliance with colonial rulers. I mean, there are also plenty of examples of Africans who end up, cooperating with, European colonists. So, it goes in all directions as far as that goes. But there are certainly examples of alliances between indigenous Americans and Africans.
Yeah, and again, this is beyond the scope of your book, but it just makes me wonder how much common ground these two groups would have found, apart from being both subjugated and, and then there's some intermarriage. I wonder in what other ways they could find common ground, apart from simply fighting the Europeans, because of language differences, culture differences, that sort of thing.
Interesting you say apart from. I have a couple of responses to that. One is, I mentioned the Brazilian example, and there's a movement called the Santidade, where they basically, it's a kind of millenarian religious movement, which involves, at times fighting Europeans, but it's basically trying to establish a more egalitarian, perhaps, society, but certainly a more open, inclusive society than what the Portuguese are offering in Brazil. And it is perceived on the part of the Portuguese to be basically designed to throw the Portuguese out. But they certainly have their own kind of vision of a better future that they're working for. Mm-hmm. But what I was going to say also about this is that my book really is meant to be focused on war. And part of me had I do actually think that war explains a great deal about, the whole patterns of interaction across the Atlantic. But I don't, it's not really a comprehensive study of all aspects of life. I hope it doesn't come across that way. So in a way, yes. How much did they share? I mean, like you said, there's a great deal of intermarriage and, people of mixed ancestry grow. I mean, interactions are not entirely always defined by military things.
Yeah. Okay. How did you do the research for this book, considering how much documentation would have been involved? What did you do?
Okay. Basically, I read other historical works, which was liberating for me because I think, academic training really, it does two things. One is it puts a huge premium on work on the archives and sort of find data that no one has ever found before, and it also encourages you to read other historians' work with a critical eye, trying to find what's missing in this person's work, and sort of defining yourself or justifying your work by saying, I found a hole in somebody else's research. And for a work like this, trying to proceed that way would have been ridiculous. And so basically what I was doing mostly was reading other people's work to, get as much as I could from it, to read it entirely positively. Obviously you have to read it critically and be careful about what you're reading, but mostly I wanted to, I hoped I could, agree with and take advantage of other people's research. Mm-hmm. Another thing that kind of kept my attention as I was doing the research is I wanted to have, individual stories. I mean, this is very definitely, designed to be a kind of history from the bottom up. I'm more interested in sailors than I am in officers, and so I did quite a lot of reading of sailors' memoirs and tried as best I could to get similar kinds of snippets of the life of ordinary soldiers, and there are certainly a few good diaries of soldiers as well that are in there, as well as stories that give you the ordinary fighter's perspective on what's happening. Mm-hmm. And then I guess the last thing I would say about my method is I was trying very hard, as much as I could, to get African and indigenous American voices in the documents. It was impossible to say, well, I'm going to give equal weight to every group, because you can't be that systematic about it. But to get that inclusiveness through each part of the book, that was definitely one of my aims.
Mm-hmm. Were there any notable archives that you used, that you went to for this research?
I think that it shows that there's probably a little more Nova Scotia in the book than anybody else would put in there, and I guess that's drawing on my earlier research. But for the most part, this is a synthetic work based on other people's work. It's not archivally formed that way.
What part of the research was most enjoyable for you?
Actually, as I said earlier, it's you're usually kind of trained to be, focused on and learn more and more about your own thing. And I really enjoyed being required to go beyond what I knew before. Mm-hmm. And so, when I was researching Peru or Chile, it was great. I mean, I really enjoyed just learning things that I didn't know. I mean, literally, there's quite a lot in this book that I didn't know before. And it's a funny thing when I'm thinking about people reading the book, I'm quite sure that there'll be specialists in the various bits that know a lot more than I do about them. But I don't think there are going to be very many people who know a lot about all of it. I think people are going to learn things in this book because of just the whole scale of it. Another thing that I enjoyed was it's got a large number of illustrations, and I did enjoy tracking them down as well.
It's interesting you mentioned Peru and Chile, because I did have it on my mind whether you extended that far in your discussion mm-hmm. of Atlantic wars. Because that's touching on the Pacific, but,
Right. Well, actually, that was, that's something Atlantic historians generally do include all of Latin America, as far north as California in the Atlantic world. And I'm not sure that they often articulated why that's so. And it became pretty clear to me as I was doing this work, organizing the book the way I did, that the reason is because of that naval supremacy that the Europeans have, which basically extends, around the Americas, at least as far as California. Mm. If you think about where do the Europeans control the ocean sort of without competition, that's it. And something else, I mean, this is related to another question that sort of ran through my mind as I was putting together the book. It's implicit in the book, I hope it comes across, that the Atlantic world is different from the Indian Ocean. And, I think there's an old sort of way of thinking about Atlantic history or imperial history that seems to think that this is the start of a pattern that spreads globally, which is true to a certain extent, but I think it's equally important to think of how distinctive the Atlantic is. And actually, at the same time that I'm, the same period that I'm studying with the Atlantic, there are all sorts of other things happening in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific off China interactions between Europeans and people there. And it's on a completely different basis. The ability of Asian people and to trade amongst themselves and develop infrastructure, which is partly, based on, it's based on a whole lot of other things. The point is that the Atlantic is different. And I think the things that make the Atlantic different apply, going back to your question, to Chile and Peru and even California.
Mm-hmm. Was there a particular question, and I know history has a lot of gaps that are hard to fill, but was there a particular question you really wanted to get an answer for and either did achieve some sort of conclusion, or you still would love to figure something out?
Okay, well, I think actually, to a certain extent, I think I am making a sort of couple of big pleas in the book. I don't think that I'm positioning myself as sort of having a definitive answer to a question, but I want to, basically convince people that war mattered enormously. And I think that there's certainly among a lot of historians that I've, worked alongside, a kind of idea that military history is a kind of obscure specialization or basically is something that, soldiers are interested in. And, I had colleagues in, various places who said, when we get to the Civil War, we just say the North won, and then they go on to, whatever happened after 1865. And so I guess I'm thinking that I hope that my book will be read by people who, I don't know. The trouble is whether they'll read it. But the point is that the military things matter, and that's that's certainly one of the things I want to push. And the other is, that the Atlantic world is a coherent unit, and that you really can't, for example, understand slavery if you don't think about simultaneously what's happening in all of the different coasts of the Atlantic. And I guess, a final thing which really, I think developed, it wasn't where I started doing the research, but this shift at the end of the 18th century, which I think really is something that's happening on an Atlantic scale. And you can't understand why there were revolutions around the Atlantic in the late 18th century without thinking about what's happening in all parts of the Atlantic world. That really does change things. I do think that that's a major disjuncture, not just in military culture, but obviously in politics and in the relative power of indigenous Americans, Africans, and Europeans.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned something that surprised you in your research. Was that, but what was the most surprising thing that you came across?
You mean on a large scale or a small scale?
Just whatever struck you through the whole course of research, what struck you most as what surprised you the most? Gave you that charge, like, wow, I didn't know that. Or I didn't expect that.
Think about that. I think actually, I'm going to give you a very specific answer.
That's fine.
I did not know, and I think people who study these things closely did, that there were galleys in the Americas, that the Havana actually deployed galleys, to guard the harbor against, English and French raiders and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. And they actually brought rowers across the Atlantic to man their galleys. And they appear in the, in the records, but I think until I wrote this book, I never really thought about that. And I guess this goes back a little bit to your question about, Mediterranean influences on the whole Atlantic world. There is, there's a direct transferal of practices and actually, I think that tells you a lot about the whole integrated nature of the Atlantic world. And also it brings it to my mind a question. I've been talking a lot about how sailing ships were really critically important for European power, but they also had huge limitations. And if you think about, why would you prefer to have a galley in your harbor? It actually tells you something about, where sailing ships are good and where sailing ships aren't so effective. Mm-hmm. But that's very specific. I could give you a grander answer, but
No, that's a good answer. So are you saying practices of the Mediterranean were transferred to the Caribbean, or just up and down the Atlantic Western Atlantic
well,
coast?
it's mostly in the Caribbean, and as part of the the protection, that the whole the Spanish Empire was very much centered on protecting forts, coastal harbors, partly to get the treasure fleet through to Spain, but it's mostly the Spanish who are doing this in the Caribbean.
Did and I know this is history isn't necessarily emotional, but was there anything you came across that had a either positive or negative emotional impact on you?
Yeah, my second chapter, which actually slightly worries me because it comes early in the book, it just describes the life of sailors, and it really, to me, it's just a painfully sad set of stories, and it may be partly because of the nature of the journals I've been reading, but the life of a sailor in the 16th, 17th century just sounds like the worst thing, almost the worst thing I could imagine. I mean, down to having to work 4-hour shifts and being under constant. I'm talking about life at sea. No privacy. And being at the under strict discipline and not in control of where you're going, and subject to outbursts of violence, and then their status and ability to live well on land is extremely limited as well. I mean, they were subject to impressment in lots of the ports, and very difficult to establish family life. And so, describing these sailors, it's just, that is actually the chapter which is weird because it's not a chapter that's about killing. It's not, it's not about combat really, but I find it the sort of the most, the most difficult to deal with in a way.
So you have talked about the things you hope the book will do, but can you bring it all together and describe what you hope a reader, apart from filling the historical gap, what would you hope a reader will take away? Well,
I guess it's not ultimately the takeaway isn't just about race, though ultimately I think a lot of it's a pretty clear part of the story from the beginning to end, and race and violence, and if I'm thinking about my book on its grandest scale, it really is about a halting process. It was not an immediate, victory on the part of Europeans and white colonists. And it matters that it took a long time for, the establishment of empires and nation states that dominated the Atlantic, reached its fulfillment. But basically the story I'm telling is the backstory to the establishment of European and national, the dominance of nation states in the Americas and empires in Africa, and I guess the military dimension of that, as I was saying earlier, is a big part of why. I mean, it involved a rewriting of history. It involved a sort of association of violence with those non-European groups, and I guess really the story I'm telling is about everybody enmeshed in violence, Europeans, Africans, and indigenous Americans together for centuries before that sharper delineation sort of in political, formalized political hierarchy took over in the 19th century. So I guess if you would ask me about my grandest ambitions, when people really would look at this closely as, basically our shared history that, so, and I think it's to go back, the only way I think you can appreciate that is to break out of national narratives, to sort of, this is not a U.S. colonial story. It's not an African history story. It's not a indigenous American story. It's a story that's happening, across a huge part of the world.
So, Central and Eastern European countries certain nations became very powerful, but it seems like they wouldn't have been part of this story at all. Maybe individuals, but not as national groups.
Well, yeah, but in a way that, I mean, there are Germans all over the Atlantic world, for example, but there isn't a sort of German state that's sending them across the Atlantic world. You go farther east than that, and then I think you're right, the representation becomes much less. As I said, Denmark, comes up a few times in my in the book. It was actually one of the, part of the point, I guess, part of the argument I would want to make is that, there are national governments that are making, allocations for military expeditions and so forth. But the forces they're sending, especially the naval forces, represent people from all over. They're not, I think it's the fleet leaving Amsterdam, and less than half of the sailors are Dutch. Mm-hmm. So, I guess part of the one thing that happens in the Atlantic world is that the boundaries between national groups in Europe become very amorphous, and people are speaking all sorts of different languages on the ships.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any difficulties getting the book finished or published?
I had a contract. I started thinking about this book in something like 2008, and I sent out proposals, and then I got, I sent out a proposal on different things and got a contract for a Quaker book about Quakers, and then it's almost out of the blue that OUP years later got back in touch with me and said, have you working on this book? And so they basically encouraged me to pick it up again, which was now 6 or 8 years ago. So I was lucky. I had the publisher before I really intensely started working on.
What's your current or future writing projects?
I have a whole, I have probably about half a dozen ideas, and I haven't made up my mind what I'm going to do next. And I think it's partly because of of the scale of this book. And I don't think it seems sort of absurd to try and take on another thing, multi-centuries across half the globe, as a next project. But I basically have to kind of decompress and rethink. I'm not sure what I'm going to do next.
Can people find you on the web? Do you have a web page or social media to follow your works or thoughts?
No, not really, no.
Okay, that's fine. I guess they can go to Oxford University Press to see details on the book.
That's right, yeah.
That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
Nope. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, please subscribe to it and rate it and review it if possible. I have many other options as well to get great military history information. You can find links to interesting military history videos on my Facebook page, WarScholar. You can find links to interesting military history news articles, military history archaeology information, and academic information on my Twitter page, WarScholar. You can find photos on my Instagram page, Chris Alvarez WarScholar. You can find my military history videos on my YouTube page, WarScholar 1945. You can also sign up for my newsletter at warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. In the newsletter, I post additional video and news links, as well as regular updates on new military history books being published. Thank you for listening.